Since you're watching this video in the fall, you've likely had winter burn in the past and want to prevent it next year. If your evergreens suddenly have needle discoloration in early spring, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. This super common condition happens in gardens all over the world, but is especially prevalent in areas with brutal winter winds and freeze-thaw cycles. It's so frustrating. The damage doesn't appear until weeks or even months later, and once it happens, there's really nothing you can do about it. To make things more complicated, a lot of the treatments we have for winter burn are unreliable, and some could even make things worse. There's a lot of advice in the gardening world, as we all know, and some of it is great, some is neutral, and some is actually pretty bad for your plants. So I'm gonna try to cut the crap and give you a research-based approach to helping your conifers through winter. Hey guys, this is Michelle at The Garden Spot, and today is a science-based deep dive into what winter burn is, what's going on with our conifers on a physiological level, and how to prevent it in the future. Now, I thought I had a pretty good understanding before I started the preliminary research for this project, and boy, did I learn a lot while making this video. Honestly, so many sources that I maybe wouldn't use to cite an article, but I would totally reference for care in my own garden, were either straight up wrong or had contradicting information. So I actually spent a full day just reading studies, trying to best understand what's going on and why it's so confusing. Now, quick disclaimer before I get going, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a nerdy gardener who loves plants, researching, and science. All right, let's figure out what's going on. Now, first up, how to identify winter burn. Now, winter burn is most easily identified by needle or leaf discoloration and drop on the south-facing side of the plant or the side of the prevailing winds in your area. This can be confusing in and of itself, especially if you're like me and see winter burn on both the south-facing side and winter burn from prevailing north winter winds. You could see browning or yellowing needles, brittle or dry needles, or total needle drop like you see in this picture of a Picea abies. It's the same one that I'm with right now. Winter burn can be mild with healthy new buds replacing the old needles, or it can be pretty severe. I've actually lost trees to winter burn in the past. The plant in question will likely look perfectly normal until about the time the daffodils and other spring blooming bulbs emerge. This is when buds are beginning to swell and most plants are breaking their winter dormancy. So the most critical thing when trying to figure out whether your tree has winter burn or something completely different is the timing of the needle discoloration. Now, if it happens while deciduous plants are breaking dormancy, that's a really good indication that it's winter burn. If it happens in the summer or the fall, it's most likely something else. There are quite a few other factors that may be misdiagnosed as winter burn, so let's quickly rule out a few of them. Up first is needle cast diseases. Certain fungal diseases can cause needle browning and dropping in spruce specifically. But these diseases cause needle drop in fall, whereas you'll see winter burn in the spring, so that helps rule that one out for you. Number 2 is natural needle drop. So this occurs in conifers in fall when conifers naturally shed their old and unproductive needles. It can actually be a lot of needles dropped, and when I first moved into this house and I saw older needles drop on a mature stand of white spruce, I called my friends in horticulture super worried, thinking that it was needle cast and that I was going to lose these trees. Unless your trees look really thin or sparse, or you're growing a plant well outside of its natural range, it's probably just a normal natural needle drop. Nothing to worry about. Number 3, insects. So spider mites, scales, aphids, they can damage evergreen foliage, causing that discoloration. And the damage from certain insects can resemble the symptoms of winter burn. But again, you're likely going to see these signs later in the season, and they're not really going to show until summer. So timing is critical in IDing winter burn. Now, lastly, salt damage. This is mostly for conifers along a roadside, but if you have a small dwarf conifers and you salt your sidewalks, you are probably going to do some damage. Environmental stress is also possible. So poor drainage, excessive heat, or inadequate sunlight, these can all put stress on plants and lead to dieback and make them more susceptible to the other things we've talked about, like fungus and insect damage. This is why when investing in conifers, it's worth it to take the time to do the research and consider whether that tree is really going to thrive in your environment. That, or you'll just have a massive death count like I do. So at the end of the day, you'll have to play a little bit of detective to figure out what exactly went wrong. But if the timing lines up, again, that's early spring, and you live in an area that's windy and cold, winter burn is pretty likely. In terms of geography, where does winter burn occur? Plants in northern areas with harsh winters, like in Canada, the northern US, and parts of Europe and Asia. These places are just more prone to winter burn. They often experience prolonged periods of freeze-thaw cycles, sudden changes in temperature, and icy conditions. You might also see winter burn in high altitude areas, in mountainous regions or prairies, anywhere where there's strong winter winds, especially if the area experienced an unseasonably dry fall. So why does winter burn happen? This might seem like an obvious answer, but it actually took a ton of research for me to get an understanding of what's actually happening to our conifers. Fascinatingly, winter burn is not necessarily about how cold a tree gets. In fact, okay, this is really cool. In laboratory settings, tissues of trees have been found to survive insanely cold temperatures, brutally cold. So researchers studied dormant one-year-old twigs of about 70 tree species across North America. The twigs were hardened off artificially for about 1 month through cold treatment. And this cold treatment triggered all of the natural responses a tree undergoes in fall to go dormant for winter. Stuff like sending out proteins to bind with H2O molecules to act as an antifreeze, and complex processes that move water out of cells so that they freeze between the cells instead of inside of them. Just so much cool stuff going on in there. After fall dormancy was triggered, the twigs were artificially frozen again to find their max freezing resistance. Out of the conifers, those from the northern US and the Rockies survived between -60 and -80 degrees Celsius. A similar study found that white pine and American arborvitae could survive freezing below -120 degrees Celsius. So the researchers hypothesized that it's not the cold that kills these conifers in nature, but instead dehydration from a combination of freezing soil and exposure to sun. One complication of having evergreen leaves is that water can escape through them. This is a serious problem since liquid H2O isn't exactly easy to come by in the winter. That's part of the reason conifers have such interesting looking leaves. Everything about them, from the size and shape of their needles to the waxy coating on the outside, is designed to reduce water loss. So even the stomata, or the tiny pore-like structures that aid in photosynthesis, they're actually recessed in protective chambers that sort of shelter them from the wind and exposure. So despite these really cool adaptations, it isn't a perfect system. Water can still transpire through the stomata. And I don't want to make it sound like this is a flaw or something. Complete water retention could be disastrous for conifers in winter, as ice doesn't exactly mesh well with cellular tissue. It tends to expand. So winter burn occurs when the loss of water in the needles surpasses the rate that it can be replenished by the roots. Pretty simple. Essentially, if your tree has winter burn, it went through a drought in winter while covered in snow. It's pretty wild, right? Now, several factors contribute to this phenomenon. I garden on the Great Plains, and if you also garden in an extremely continental area, or far from the coasts or Great Lakes, then you know how variable yearly moisture levels can be. When we have an unseasonably dry fall, there's just less water available to the plant going into winter. No water, the tree suffers from drought, just like in a dry summer. For a similar reason, newly planted evergreens are especially susceptible to winter desiccation because their root structures are small and they're shallow, reducing the overall amount of water available. It also means that they have less access to water below the frost line. Now, in this image of the maximum frost depth over 100 years, you can see just how deep this can go. Where I garden, it looks about 50 inches. In Denver, about the same. Some parts of the US, of course, it doesn't occur at all. And then in the most brutal areas of northern Minnesota and North Dakota, look at that. It's near 10 feet. That's incredible. Now, of course, this is the maximum depth over 100 years, but still, it shows why it's so hard for conifers to access water, liquid water, in the winter. Additionally, winter burn happens because of dry winds, drying out the needles. And if you live in the Great Plains, this could be one of the biggest reasons for your winter burn. Okay, so you may have heard that conifers photosynthesize over the winter. Now, if you don't want to dive into conifer physiology, I get it, skip ahead to the next chapter. But if you hang in with me here, there's going to be a total light bulb moment that might go off. Like, at least that's how I felt once I learned this stuff, and it really helped me to understand why some conifers have it worse than others. So you've heard that conifers photosynthesize over the winter, and maybe you've even been told that this is the entire reason for conifers to keep their needles. This first sentence is somewhat true, while the latter is definitely an overstatement, but I'll talk more about that a little bit later. To really understand what's going on, let's look at the rate of photosynthesis in two conifers. You've got a Picea abies, or Norway spruce, like this one here, and Pinus sylvestris, or Scots pine. These are the two dominant species of conifers in the boreal forests of Sweden, where samples of needles were collected by researchers and studied. In this image, you can see annual temperatures on the left in Celsius. In July, days are about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, while in January, the lows dipped it to about -4 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty typical winter, right? Now let's look at markers of photosynthesis activity. In this diagram, we can see photosynthesis occurring in each species. The black line with a little triangle is the Norway spruce, while the dashed line with the circle is the Scots pine. The arrows indicate bud break. Now, what's so interesting in this diagram is that through CO2 assimilation, aka photosynthesis, we see that the Scots pine goes pretty much dormant from October to April, and then starts photosynthesizing like crazy, peaking in June with maximum sunlight and tapering off again in winter. We also see a bit of photosynthesis occur for the Scots pine in April, which we might attribute to a warm spell, where conditions were right to photosynthesize, and then the conifer took advantage of, those evergreen needles. But other than that, this isn't much different than what's going on with a deciduous tree in terms of photosynthesis. The Scots pine just really isn't doing that much photosynthesizing over the winter. So what the heck is happening with the Norway spruce? It photosynthesizes throughout the entire winter. And there is no increase in activity once it warms up. In fact, during those long days in June, we actually see a reduction of CO2 assimilation. Well, so what does that show us? For one, there is clearly a difference between species as to whether they continue to photosynthesize throughout the winter, which is why this was so hard for me to find in the first place. But something else researchers noticed was winter burn on the Norway spruce and not so much on the Scots pine come spring. So what gives? What's going on? Well, because they retain their needles, they've got to figure out what to do with all of that extra radiation from the sun that continues to hit the photosynthetic apparatus on the needles. It has to go somewhere. For the Scots pine, they're able to turn off photosynthesis and instead turn on some cool proteins that create an electron sink to dissipate all the extra energy from the sun as heat. For the Norway spruce, it never evolved the ability to create an alternative electron sink. So when their photosynthetic apparatus is bombarded in late winter and early spring, when it's both, super, super cold and super, super bright, it gets damaged. So if you grow Picea abies like this tree here, then you are probably having the same light bulb moment I had, because Norway spruce are so susceptible to winter burn. Until now, I didn't really understand why. I guess I just thought that they weren't that good of a tree. But this led me to re-examine what I thought I knew about pretty fundamental questions about conifers. So if keeping their needles on during the winter is so damaging, why aren't all trees deciduous? I mean, it's a pretty basic question, right? But what's the advantage of being a conifer if the needles are so easy to damage? For one, winter burn doesn't usually kill established trees. It might make them look a little sad, but from a survival standpoint, it's not a bad trade-off for being able to keep your leaves. Next year's buds are generally less susceptible to damage, and I'll pull up a photo of a Picea abies in my garden pulling out of winter looking just fine. It's actually this one right here. And so by not having to form new leaves in the spring, species like Picea abies can continue to photosynthesize all year long instead of just the short season. So think about conifers growing just below the tree line. The last frost might be early June and first frost might be September. That's not much of a growing season. And species like Pinus sylvestris, while not photosynthesizing much in winter, can get a jump on that spring sun. which we saw as an increase in CO2 assimilation in April. But even more importantly, by waiting 3 to 5 years to discard their needles, conifers are able to conserve precious soil nutrients, kind of like carrying around a backpack with a few snacks in it. It's convenient, right? Especially when you're living in some of the toughest places on Earth. You know, conifers live in the boreal forests and deserts and rocky outcroppings where nutrients and moisture are not easy to come by. Imagine just being able to carry it around with you instead. So that's all interesting, but what are gardeners supposed to actually do about it? Now, site treatment and species selection makes a difference here. Here are some of the factors that make a tree more likely to have winter desiccation. An evergreen is at greater risk of winter burn if it's 1, planted in fall rather than spring, meaning it lacks that established root system. 2, exposed to a south or a southwest orientation, especially for Norway spruce. 3, excessively exposed to winter winds or planted on a high hill. 4, planted in dry, coarse, or poorly drained soils, or stressed from drought, insects, or disease. Or 6, lacks protective mulch. Now, unfortunately, these are usually the conditions exactly where we cite conifers. You know, most need full sun in the summer and aren't picky about lean soils and make great windbreaks for the rest of our garden. So how do we actually protect these conifers? Now, addressing winter burn is about prevention, not treatment. Here are a few things you can do to protect your plants. The best thing you can do is water going into winter. Now, a modest reduction in water is good from what I have read because research shows that it helps the plant go dormant. The last thing you want to do is increase new growth, but more importantly, you don't want your conifers to enter winter with any drought stress. Make sure that new conifers get watered at least once a week throughout the entire season and continue going into fall and throughout fall when the temps are above freezing and the ground is dry. Begin watering again well before the last frost if conditions are dry. You may read online that you should plant conifers on north and northeast sides of buildings because they'll likely be protected from winter sun. That's just bad advice, unless a conifer can take an extreme amount of shade, which very, very few can. Instead, make a barrier. So you can make a natural barrier by planting ornamental grasses around your trees. These grasses are going to catch leaves and snow, helping to insulate that tree. Or you can use a snow screen or a snow fence to block the prevailing wind and build up snow around the tree. Lastly, you could use a burlap or a sunscreen to protect the tree from winter sun and winter wind. This might be especially helpful for a Norway spruce. However, this barrier should not touch the tree and should be open to the top to let light in. Whatever you do, don't use plastic. Plastic is going to heat up, trap moisture, and make the environment around your tree even more extreme than if you did nothing at all. So I see trusted sources say to wrap your trees fully in burlap. Don't do that. Remember, some of our conifers are still photosynthesizing throughout the winter. Plus, think about, what's going to happen when you take that burlap off in the spring. If you've ever done any seed starting or if you vacation your houseplants outdoors for the winter, then you know that your plants need to be gradually and incrementally exposed to an increase in light. Other things you can do include adding a layer of mulch. So mulch can help regulate temperature and moisture at the same time, making it really, really valuable. Don't plant trees in the fall, so there isn't enough time for them to establish those new roots before winter. Don't prune after July. Pruning stimulates new growth, and that's what can easily be damaged. Now, at this time, I can't recommend an anti-desiccant spray. There's a ton of contradicting research to go through, and I've never personally tried it. So I think I'm gonna do a separate video on it. But if you do use it, tread lightly and follow the directions to a T. All that being said, if a conifer is well suited to your environment, it's really only going to be susceptible to winter burn for the first few years. You might just decide that doing nothing at all and accepting a little damage allows you to just go on with your life. Of course, you can only have that approach if you choose the right conifers. So let's look at some conifers in my own garden. What grows well for me may or may not work for you. Here's a quick rundown of what I grow. So compare it to your own garden to get a feel for how to interpret my success and failure with different species. My garden is located in the foothills of the Black Hills and Bear Lodge Mountains. It's hardiness zone 5A, silty loam soil. Rainfall is about 20 inches per year, but varies from year to year pretty dramatically. The summers are around 85 degrees with a few weeks of 100 plus. Spring and fall have an extreme freeze-thaw conditions. Our freeze-thaw cycle is super lengthy and it starts, the end of September through December and then March through May. Our winters are pretty unpredictable. Sometimes we experience, a ton of snowfall. Other years we're lucky to get half what we usually get. It isn't unusual to have a wind chill of negative 40 degrees, although our winter low is usually around negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is a hardiness zone map. Most gardeners are familiar with it, so I won't linger here. And considering that hardiness isn't the biggest factor in winter burn, it's not as useful as you might think. But anyway, I'm here in zone 5A. Now this map is much more useful and it shows moisture levels across the US. I'm here getting about 20 inches of water a year. If you get less or more or the same moisture as me, that's gonna impact how your conifers overwinter without supplemental water. So the drier your climate, the more important to choose drought-tolerant conifers, regardless of zone hardiness, as long as they meet your lowest temperature. Now this map is my favorite. This is a climate map. So you can see me over here. If you choose conifers adapted to climates like your own, you're likely gonna have success. Okay, so here's how a handful of conifers did in my own garden. The first list is on an exposed site with no windbreak from dry northern winds. These are the conifers that have not gotten winter burn. Ready? Okay. We have weeping white spruce, Picea glauca pendula, Black Hills spruce, another Picea glauca, Mugo pine, Rocky Mountain juniper, I grew skyrocket and Wichita blue, and ponderosa pine. Up next are the conifers at the same site with, a tiny bit of winter burn. That included blue spruce, both weeping and the globe type, and juniper squamata, blue star. Up next are the conifers in my backyard, which is protected by a tall line of 40-foot tall trees and a privacy fence. So Picea abies, this species is probably the most disappointing. Despite being my most protected areas, Picea abies just always gets winter burn. And based on what we now know, it's because it has no way of dissipating radiation from the sun during winter. Dwarf Alberta spruce, so these definitely need protection. Whenever I see them around town, they always have winter burn. Mine get winter burn. It's too bad. Eastern arborvitae, so they had winter burn the first 2 years. Now it's negligible. Fall cypress, what a great plant. So far, no winter burn, and it's so beautiful. I would even try it in a more exposed site. So on the screen, I'm gonna do a few that I planted this year, and I can't yet speak to their performance, but look through these. I'll update you guys and let you know how they did after we go through a winter. There's a huge variety of conifers, so it'll be a really good test of hardiness for all different kinds. Thanks so much for hanging out. I would love to know the general location of where you grow and which conifers have or haven't had winter burn in your garden. If you dug this video and want more science-based content, give this a thumbs up and hit subscribe. That's it from me at the Garden Spot, and I hope you find some time to get out in your garden this week.